Did anyone ever tell you that there are 12 historical facts that verify Jesus literally rose from the dead? And did you know that these 12 historical facts are accepted as true by over 90% of the most influential New Testament historical scholars in the world today? Well, it's true. So my question to you is, would you be interested in hearing what these 12 historical facts are? My guest today is Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the world's most respected and well-known scholars on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Professor Habermas holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Michigan State University in History and Philosophy of Religion. And he is the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He's also the author, co-author, or editor of over 40 books. So we invite you to join us for this special edition of the John Ankerberg Show to hear these 12 historical facts that show Jesus literally rose from the dead. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg, and my guest is Dr. Gary Habermas, and we're talking about a topic for those of you that are skeptical about religion, okay? You don't really care about Christianity, and you don't think there's anything special about Jesus. You don't think he did miracles. You don't think he rose from the dead. And so therefore, you really don't care about anything. We are in Sweden and in the Scandinavian countries. We're also in places like India and Africa and Europe. And, I know right off the bat, people just told me this week, up here in Scandinavia, 8 out of 10 people are atheistic. And in Europe, it's basically 5 out of 10. In America, they tell us the millennials are going toward skepticism and so on. And I'm just saying, okay, we want to do a program for you. And I want to ask you this question as we start out program 2. Okay, we've already done program 1. Would it make a difference to you if we presented to you 12 historical facts about Jesus' resurrection that are accepted by almost 95% of the greatest scholars around the world? Would that make a difference to you? You say, well, what are the facts? Well, that's what we're talking about. Now, the first ones that we talked about last week, quick review, was, number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Actually, a lot of people say, well, what could be controversial about the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion? Why do scholars across the world believe it? And we're talking about scholars in the 90th percentile of the top scholars in the world believe this, okay? Now, number 2 was Jesus was buried. Well, people die. Once they die, they're buried. Well, we didn't go into too much about the fact is he was buried in a tomb, all right? And we need to unpack that a little bit further. And because it's been a controversial point, and if we're saying that most of these facts, historical facts that we're giving you, are accepted by 90 to 95% of the greatest scholars in the world, the most influential scholars in the world, critical New Testament scholars, from Edinburgh to Harvard to you name it, Princeton, the fact is, these scholars, they accept these facts. Now, this one here, the numbers, we have to be honest with you, go down a little bit. Gary, I'm glad that you're here. And tell us why on the empty tomb, if we say, Jesus was actually buried, and we know the name of the place where he's buried, in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, why do the numbers go down from, say, 95% down to another number?
Yeah, actually, it's the other way around. When I started grad school in the early 70s, if I'd spoken up in class and said, I can show the empty tomb occurred. Now, I wouldn't have done that because I didn't have the data and was very skeptical. But if I had said that, somebody could say to me, are you a conservative Catholic or are you an evangelical? Because they were about the only ones who believed it. And at that time, a fair number of scholars, the empty tomb was way down on the list. It was not a given. It would not have been in that list from the early 70s for the same group of scholars. So if anything, the fact that, according to my head count of scholarship, which, by the way, the notes alone are 1,500 pages of that 4,700.
And you've been doing it since what, 1975, and you've been doing it in
75 to date.
Yeah, and you've been doing it in English, and you've been doing it in French and German. You've been checking
French,
all the
German,
scholars
English
out.
sources. And many of the French and German sources are translated now, but a lot of them aren't.
Right.
And but so what I'm saying is, what's amazing is not the negative, how come only 75% of the people believe this? The question is, why is it up from maybe 15% in the early 70s? Why has it come up? And the list for the empty tomb, a list of evidences, would over the way critics do facts. Remember the spider on the web? We're going to only take facts which can be guaranteed, pretty much, according to the data. There's over 20 of those indications that the tomb was empty.
Yeah.
That's why it's admitted today.
Yeah, and I want to stop right here because I got to throw this in. So what's changed in the last 15 years while we've been doing this is that the historical tools that they've used on secular history has been brought over to the New Testament.
Correct.
And they've said, hey, these aren't just traditional stories, these are bios, Roman bios. What's a Roman bio?
The Roman biography, Greco-Roman biography, because before Romans, going back to the Greeks, and it's narrative. It's a storytelling venue that is a little bit different than what historians do today, but there was still evidence gathering. They didn't have you couldn't go to your scroll shelf and pull all the scrolls off and have 52 endnotes, but they did do some good research, and the rules that they applied, historical rules for applying to texts, like for example, we've already done one, the more independent sources you have, the better. So independent attestation is very important. That's a rule. Well, as they started applying the historical rules, the numbers went up. Well, a young scholar about 1990, Richard Burridge, did a doctoral dissertation in England comparing Greco-Roman biography to the Gospels. And he said, look at all these characteristics, but here they are in the Gospels. And yeah, they're different, but they're different from each other. So they look like Greco-Roman biographies, and that conclusion has pretty much been accepted across the board. So with it comes all the historicizing type principles that make facts recognizable.
And things have changed. Now, we've got a list over here of a pile of books, and I said, hey, as we were prepping for this program, I said, hey, give me some of the sources that are new. And one of them was Richard Bauckham, one of the professors at Cambridge, okay, one of those 500-page books that you gave me.
Yep.
And the fact is, when I read his book, he said, on the basis of Roman bios, the fact is we ought to call the Gospels really testimony, eyewitness testimony of events that happened. And then he quoted Josephus and some of the others in saying that the best kind of historian was the guy that was actually on the scene and was a part of it and saw it and experienced it and could write about it.
Correct.
Okay? And so they brought that kind of information over from Roman historians and from Jewish historians, and then they brought that into the New Testament. And so we want the folks to know where we're coming from on these facts. We're giving you historical data accepted by critical, knowledge Christian scholars across the world. Doesn't mean that we are not Christians, we don't believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God. It's just not, we're approaching it that way. We're approaching this, if you're going to Harvard, if you're going to Princeton, if you're going to the University of Illinois, if you're going any place else, the fact is that's the basis where you can check this stuff out, okay?
Right.
Now, I have another question I want to come to. First of all, we had Jesus died by crucifixion. Nobody doubts that. He was buried. The death caused the disciples to despair. Obviously, if you lose your best friend and you thought he was the Messiah and you thought more about him, the fact is when he's murdered on a cross and you watch that, they all went into despair. Okay, and then we come to this fourth one. The tomb was found empty on the third day, okay? We'll come back to that one. I want to go to the fifth one. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Okay, now here's one of the most important proofs. And on the basis of what kind of data do we have that is within 24 months of the resurrection that shows us they had experiences of the risen Jesus?
Well, maybe the most important single argument. Here's the way critics would argue. They would start with the Apostle Paul.
Right.
He said he's the critic's darling, and he is. They're going to grant 7 books, and Paul returns to the resurrection time and time again. Actually, this is a whole other topic, but he quotes little tiny snippets that were in existence long before the book that he wrote. Today we call it a footnote.
Right.
And he would have these sources. Well, those sources, almost all the time, it's always about death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus died for us. He was raised. Disciples saw him. the data are listed there. And the most important one is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 and 2, Paul talks about it. But in verses 3 through 7, there's one or more creeds. I say or more. Some people think 2 or 3 of them, Paul strung them together. But there's an early creed there. And in that list, it's the longest list of appearances, longer than the gospel list.
Yeah.
Longest list of
when
appearances.
we say creeds, we're not talking about those that were down at 300 or 400. We're talking about those that are little sayings that the Christians that were in the time of Jesus, that they said. And obviously, after Jesus was crucified, rose again, and passed off the scene, the fact is the church still did doing church. And the scholars want to know, what in the world did they say when they did church?
Yeah.
Okay? Because what they said, if we can find out what they said, what was the core of their beliefs? Okay?
Right.
And we're going to do that in another program. But the fact is, I'm just simply saying that's what we're talking about. Paul is talking about this is something that the Christians were talking about before he got saved on the road to Damascus. If he got saved 2 years after the crucifixion, the fact is this was even earlier, and we got all kinds of evidence for this. Keep going.
Yeah, and in that list, there are a half dozen appearances. Now, Paul adds his own at the end. But there are 3 to individuals. Starts with Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, the Apostle Paul. He says, last of all, he appeared to me. Paul's not in the original list, but he tacks his on to the end. But here's the important thing here. 3 groups are in that list. There's a group called the 12. There's a group called all the apostles. And then there's one 500. And by the use of the word 500 brethren, it's like the feeding of the 5,000. It's possible if they did a male head count only, there could have been 15,000 when Jesus fed the group,
and
there could have been way over 500 when Jesus appeared to that group. So your 3 group appearances, not the only 3, but the 3 really important ones are the 3 earliest ones, reported by whom? Cited by Paul, that scholars think is an honest PhD in the Old Testament. So, this is like, it's all coming together around this one fact. They had experiences, and they were totally convinced they'd seen the risen Jesus.
Yeah, what I find interesting about that is all of the scholars agree with it. Even Bart Ehrman has got a whole chapter in his book about this, and the fact is he agrees with that, and he quotes it, okay? And the fact is that this is within 24 months, okay? And he says it's actually earlier. It might go right straight back to Jerusalem. Now, what's the significance of that?
Yeah, he says almost all these little snippets that are in Paul being the earliest writer, all these little tiny snippets, and by the way, in the Greek, they read in the Greek like da 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 da. So they stick out like a sore thumb in the text. Critics agree to where these major ones are located. And so Paul writes them, and Bart Ehrman says, everyone he put in his epistles could have originated in Jerusalem, and they may have been around, before he took his famous journey to Damascus. Now, the key there is that Rudolf Bultmann, who was more skeptical than Bart Ehrman, but he's decades before that, 30s, 40s, 50s of the last century, and Bultmann says, well, yeah, we've got these early creeds, and this stuff is reported in the earliest church, Bultmann says. Well, he couldn't live with that because he didn't think we had much of an historical basis for Jesus. He said you can know almost nothing about the historical Jesus. And so what does he do with these facts that you can know? He said, well, they were imported from Hellenism. Christians heard those things and brought them over from Greek thought. If it starts in Jerusalem with the apostles, with the apostolic testimony, Paul's there just 3 years later, talks to Peter and James. That ties this up. You may not believe Jesus has been raised from the dead, but the fact that Paul interviewed people who saw him during that famous, according to Luke, 40-day period after the cross, Paul's sitting there interviewing these guys, and Bart Ehrman lists the crucifixion and Paul's interview with those 2 men, and then later he comes back and John is there. So the big 4, Paul, Peter, James the brother of Jesus, and John, he lists those 2 events, crucifixion and Paul's meetings, as the most important singular historical pieces of data about the historical Jesus.
Yeah, and I love about Richard Bauckham, professor at Cambridge. The fact is, he said, quoting another scholar, he says, when those early eyewitnesses said that, they didn't immediately go right to heaven. they stuck around, okay? And we have records of the disciples.
That's
obviously down the pike. They wrote the Gospels, okay? And in the Gospels and in their books, the fact is they started putting some of these snippets in there. And the scholars, as they read them, they could find this stuff, okay?
Yeah.
But I love this other book that you gave me from Oscar Cullmann, okay? Talk a little bit about Oscar Cullmann.
Yeah, Oscar Cullmann is writing back in the day when Rudolf Bultmann was around. Now, Bultmann wrote his famous skeptical essay in 1941. In that same decade, Oscar Cullmann is writing a little book called The Earliest Christian Confessions. And he starts noticing, only a few other scholars at this point have noticed these things, but he starts writing about these snippets in the New Testament, the da phrases in Greek that have been interpreted into the text. I mean, twice Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he says, I gave you what I was given. Now that's like saying, I tell my grad students, that's an ancient footnote.
Yep.
When Paul says, I gave you what I was given, that's like us saying, well, even Bart Ehrman agrees. Even the German atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann agrees. That's how we do endnotes. Now, if we're doing today, we put a number down there in this text. Paul just says, I got this from somebody authoritative before me.
What I loved about Cullmann was it was such a simple book, and it's only 50 pages, okay?
Yeah.
And the fact is, he says, how do we find out what these early Christians believed when they didn't even have the New Testament, okay? What were they saying? What were they doing? And he says, there's like 6 areas. We got baptism. That was still going on. We have exorcism. They were preaching in services. They were singing songs. We have all these. Yeah, the fact is, where do we find that kind of stuff? And he starts looking for it, and he writes a whole little book on where these verses are at. And I thought, boy, how dumb do you have to be? All these years, and here it is. Obviously, the Christians were doing something after Jesus went up to heaven, after the resurrection, after Pentecost. Fact is, Acts says they went across the empire proclaiming this message.
Yeah. And now Cullmann was on that border there. He was French-German. But another British scholar, C.H. Dodd from Cambridge, wrote a little book called The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. It actually predates Cullmann's book, and he's real big on the Acts sermon summaries, which are a species of creed. And Dodd is the one who coined that famous phrase, you quoted the one, they didn't go exactly to heaven. Dodd said, Paul came down and spent 15 days with Peter and James, and they did more than talk about the weather.
Yeah, and the thing is, from the beginning, the disciples and early Christian leaders and this people that went across the Roman Empire, the resurrection was the central message, okay? Hands down, this is what they preached all across it. You get this from secular writers who are ticked that they were doing it, and the fact is you have it from everybody, and it's shot right out of the box from Jerusalem right at that early period, even before Paul got saved 2 years later.
Yeah, when we say get shot out of a cannon or when someone comes out fast, we're presupposing something propelled them.
Right, something happened.
Propelled the message. And it's Richard Bauckham, among others. He's not the only one. But Richard Bauckham says the consensus New Testament view among critics, incredible word, the consensus view is that this material was established from the beginning. James D.G. Dunn says that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, probably within months of the cross. Now, we know the cross happened in the spring. If the creed came months later, it could well have been 30 A.D. It could have been the very year Jesus was crucified. This creed is already out. Why? That's what shot it out of the box. These things just work together with an evidence message that is not seen anywhere else.
Yeah. Number 9, the church was born and grew. That's obvious. The fact is, all of a sudden, the explosion that came out of Jerusalem because of the resurrection and people seeing him, the fact is, all of a sudden, they spread the word. They went all across the Roman Empire, and you had an explosion of Christianity that came, and basically, by 300 years later, it changed the entire Roman Empire. Okay?
That's a real key. Jerusalem's really important. To some people, that's a duh. Well, I guess it did get started there. Bart Ehrman says the creeds all came from Jerusalem. But here's what they're missing. If this was preached in Rome, it's very unlikely that I would take my hard-earned dollars, if I had them, and got on a ship and went back to Israel to investigate this. The fact that the preaching happened in the city where you could check out the empty tomb, where you could check out the guys Remember, Paul went there 3 years later, and Peter and James are still there. You could interview the guys who saw the risen Jesus. You could do your journalistic work. This is the city where it happened. It's not up in France. It's not Germany. It's not even Rome. It's not in Alexandria. This is the city. It started, was reported, could be checked out, and Paul went to them, meaning he knew where to get the message. So as Bauckham says, here's the important point. As Bauckham says, scholarship agrees with that scenario. Jerusalem is the base, all the data are there, and it could be checked out.
Yeah, we're going to do 12 historical facts, and Gary, I want to slow it down for the people here in the last couple of minutes while we close this off. I don't want this to be just an academic discussion that we're having that people say, hey, that's really, really interesting. I've never heard that before. This thing was real to you and to me. The fact is you were going to be a Buddhist, and the fact is you changed your mind because of the historical data. The data didn't change. Something happened to you. And something needs to happen to some of our viewers that are listening to it. They shouldn't be just listening to it and saying, hey, that's really interesting. It has more implications than that. Talk about it.
Yeah, and you know what? A lot of people, when they give testimonies like that, they'll say, well, I was an atheist till I met the Lord. And if you ask them, when was that? They might go, oh, I was 15. And you go, some atheist you were. When I made that Buddhist comment, I had already had my PhD. I'd already finished my study. You go, then why are you thinking about these things? Because I just didn't accept things because it was there in front of me. It took a long time for these things to sink in. So the Buddhist comment was post-PhD. And I don't say that a lot because people are thinking, wow, what's wrong with you? What? You already had the data. Why didn't you believe it? But it takes a while to sink in. People come back. I read more critics than I read anybody conservative. And so that stuff works on you, and you want to say, well, do I know what's right?
Okay, for the kid that says, or for the man that says, or for the person that's dying that says, or for the person that's in India or Africa or Sweden right now, the fact is, to those people that are on the line thinking about this, what should they do about it? Do they say, you know what, it sounds pretty good to me that Jesus Christ actually lived, claimed to be the Son of God, died on the cross, and rose again, and is living now. What should I do with that information?
You know, it's like the old question that if you're going to get married, if you're going to make any kind of commitment to people, but marriage is just the best known one we have. A lot of thought goes into, do I want to say I do? Famous commitment words. Well, that's what the Greek word means. The Greek word for believe actually means this. Yeah, I believe. Strawberry ice cream and Jesus Christ. It's not like I believe. It's I've taken a step and I'm following. You know, we don't enter commitments. We don't enter I do's in our lives, whether it's business or marriage or having children. We don't enter those questions lightly. And I think it takes a lot of wise people to sift through the data, and that's time consuming.
Yeah, and so what we're advising is that you think about what's being said, and somewhere along the line, if you're convinced that Jesus Christ is God, that he can save you, can forgive you of your sins, and come into your life, you can have a personal relationship with the God of the universe, then you have to tell him that you admit you're a sinner, and you have to say to him, I do. I'm going to follow you. Okay? It's not just, hey, yeah, I believe that. It's, I do. I'm going to follow you. Okay? And I would ask that you would think about it carefully. All right, next week we're going to continue our 12, so I hope that you'll join us, but stay tuned. I got a personal word for you in just a moment.